Hi everybody, I'm meteorologist Matt Gray. Welcome to another edition of the Brainstorm here on YouTube on 4 News Now. If you like this video, like the like button and subscribe to 4 News Now for all the best local content from the inland Northwest. Speaking of local content, boy, we really had some last night, didn't we? I'm going to go through a couple of our friends of 4 News Now, photographers. And this is from Rockland, Washington last night. Central Washington really got the best of the aurora that we had told you about on Wednesday evening, that we said, hey, look out, this thing's coming. And, well, look at this, Mike Crawford. Man, this is incredible. And you could see the multicolors, little hues of purple at the top, some kind of pinkish red in the center, a little line of yellow, and then down into the green as you get closer to the horizon. Friend Alan Birdsell also seeing the same thing. You can see that fade to purple to magenta-ish red to that green down at the bottom. And finally, Sandra Nickel in Green Bluff. Clouds cleared enough just for her, so she could see a little bit of that red and that purple and red on top of green. So, question tonight: why do we have the colors like that in the aurora, and why does it layer out in that particular way? So, unlike what we see with, say, rainbows and things like that, this is a different kind of atmospheric optics. This is about the types of molecules that those charged particles from the sun, the solar storm, is interacting with. So let's check this out, right? So here we are, we're on Earth, we're spinning around. We're going to go to the very tip-top levels of the atmosphere. And even though there's not a whole lot of air up there, say above 200 miles, what there is quite a bit of oxygen. That's the most of what you're going to find, and fortunately it's not enough to breathe. And I'll kind of give you some perspective as far as weather that we know and love and where the aurora is located in our layers of the atmosphere in just a little bit. But here's this kind of layer breakdown as far as the northern lights are concerned. So, as some of the solar energy moves through that upper level of the atmosphere, it'll run into some of these oxygen atoms, and so it'll pass through and it'll create a red coloration as it interacts with those oxygen atoms. Now, as it goes further down, then you become a little bit of a mix. So you've got some oxygen and you've got some nitrogen. Remember, the atmosphere is 70% nitrogen down here where we live, and then 20% is oxygen, and then the rest is a little bit of traces here or there of little other gases. So basically, it's all pretty much just nitrogen and oxygen. So those are the big ones to work with. That's what all this solar energy is running into. And so as you get into these kind of middle upper layers of the entirety of the Earth's atmosphere, that's where we get that green color, that bluish, yellowish green that we are so familiar with as the color of the northern lights. And so that's why we get that red coloration on top of that green coloration, because as these charged particles from the sun, they're going to run into some nitrogen that will glow blue, but blue is pretty hard to see, especially in the middle of the night. And so then you get these, basically it's splitting some of these nitrogen molecules. They'll get little pieces of their atoms that are flying around, and then these charged particles, they'll hit an oxygen atom right after that, and that will glow green. So we end up having green being the dominant color, but you do get a little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow in this layer as well. And so this is where this layer here is very much where most of the aurora energy gets up, or ends up basically the atmosphere ends up getting rid of all that solar energy, and it doesn't make it any further down into the atmosphere. Now you go further down, really intense auroras, they'll have a line of pink or magenta, hot pink or magenta on the bottom. And so that's even getting into an even lower level of the atmosphere where there's more nitrogen and more oxygen content, and so you get that really bright magenta color line on the bottom for the most intense auroras. But mostly we get that green over red, kind of like we saw on Wednesday night. And it's just simply different layers of the atmosphere having different concentrations of different molecules. Now, give you some perspective here. The aurora along with these outer layers of the atmosphere, are basically in what we would consider space. But there's magnetic field, and there's still particles of the atmosphere that are up in that part of the world. So you can see the aurora basically sits anywhere between the very bottom of the mesosphere and very intense auroras, above, mostly is above what we call the Kármán line, which is essentially the boundary of when you get above that, you're in space. And yeah, sure, there's some oxygen, there's some nitrogen up there for this aurora to interact with, for these solar storms to interact with, along with the magnetic field of Earth. But there isn't enough to breathe, that's for sure. So for all intents and purposes, at least for us, it is outer space. But there's just enough up there that it helps protect us from meteors and solar energy and radiation and all these other nasty things that would be a real problem if you were just sitting out there in a spacesuit. It's one of the reasons why deep space travel is actually really difficult, because there's a lot of radiation zipping around out there, and places like you're on the space shuttle or in the space station, you're still somewhat in the protection of our planet. So you got a little bit of a protective shield from the planet itself. But you can see basically that little layer at the bottom, that bottom 7 miles of the atmosphere, that's the troposphere. That's where all of the weather we talk about on a day-to-day basis happens. You get to the stratosphere, that's where the ozone layer is. That's where a lot of by the time you get to the bottom or the top of it, it's where a lot of the meteors burn up. And that's where you get your commercial jets flying. You go above that, yep, you get to the mesosphere, and then you're ending up basically in space, or at least you get yourself into orbit. So yeah, some pretty interesting stuff here as far as the atmosphere, it being bigger than you think, but also smaller than you think as well. Because remember, the vast majority, you're talking about over 90% of the atmosphere, at least as far as content, is below that Kármán line. And really the vast majority of it is actually in the troposphere. And that's why we get all the active weather and why it's safe for us to breathe down here. So there you go. Some interesting stuff about the aurora, why it gets its colors, how it interacts with Earth's atmosphere. And we got a couple more nights where we might still see a little bit of aurora. So that'll be fun. And we'll probably see more northern lights here as the solar cycle of the sun continues to amp up all the way through 2025. So I think it's going to be a great period of time to take up some nighttime photography skills. I know I'm going to get started. All right. Thanks for watching the Brainstorm. Remember to hit that like button here in 4 News Now, and we'll talk to you again soon.